That should get Deb in. Steve.
Hello.
Hey, Steve. Robert. Deb should be clicking in here in a sec. There she is.
I've been promoted.
Yeah, when you start it in practice mode, it doesn't let you get in until you actually start the webinar for some reason. All right. Welcome, everybody. I think we have everybody here. I got an email from Gil this morning that he is out of the country and will be away from internet access during this time, so we won't be able to make it. And for those of you who just clicked in, Councilor Moran said he has a plumbing issue, so he will be in and out of the meeting while he's dealing with his localized plumbing issue this afternoon. So I think we do have a quorum, and I think we can kick off the meeting and get going. And so the kind of the first order of business before we get into discussion is a motion to approve the minutes by the committee. So I'll leave that out there for someone, or any changes, edits, and then a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve.
We have a second. Bob?
I'm trying to find the minutes.
You open up the PDF, they should be, and open up the bookmark, you should be able to click right to them, George.
Okay. Can you just tell me what page they're on, Scott?
Oh, you get, now I have to find it. Here we go.
I think they're page 32.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, page 32.
I'll second them.
Did you speed read them, George?
Pretty much, yeah. I read the motions and saw if there was anything I didn't agree with.
So do we have a unanimous consensus then for approval of the minutes? Thumbs up, head nod, thumbs up, all right. Okay, just a quick refresher for the group. From the last time, the committee made two recommendations regarding the single family SDC and the baseline condition, and also for multifamily to calculate the SDC based on dwelling units. So those are the kind of the hard and firm actions that the group made that we'll be bringing forward to the city council shortly. The other action that you guys requested was to have an additional meeting to talk about a couple things, SDC deferrals and the collection of charge portions of the existing municipal code, and also some information and background and discussion regarding storm drain credits. So we have Deb, and she has a presentation to walk through, talk about what we've done so far, and talk about the SDC code, deferral of charge options, and collection of charge options, and the storm drain credits. So as part of any action today, on top of having a discussion about that and making a recommendation or recommendations to the council for code changes, the last kind of real item of business is to finalize the discussion about the SDC payment phasing and phasing options. And those options are to not phase the SDC in, phase it over 1, 2, or 3 years. And so Deb will kind of cover that and the breakdown in her presentation. So that's the other kind of action we're asking the committee to take this afternoon, so we can bring forward this whole process and all the information to council and a study session in the future. And then finally in a business meeting for adoption of the SDC resolution and updated methodology. So really with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deb, make sure that we can do the, oops, not me, share the screen. We're going to let Deb share the screen with her presentation, and then we'll go from there. And as always, I'll keep a lookout for questions from the group as we go through and begin the discussion.
Okay, great. Let's see. How are you seeing just the one slide or slide and next slide?
Just the one.
Good. I've had some issues today. Great. Well, nice to sort of see everybody again. We are, so I'll give just a very brief presentation, which I believe you all got a copy of, along with the more, the longer memo and attachments, just to talk about the prior committee decisions, but Scott did a great job of that. The phasing, the collection of the charge, and the stormwater SDC credits. It's not that it's taken us 6 months since we last met to do this work, because there hasn't been a lot of new work done. We, just as a reminder, we were under the assumption that the state, because it's doing a deep dive look at a number of the things in the statutes, one of which is timing of collection and deferrals, that we wanted to be able to, since it seemed that that was on the same similar time track. Originally, the goal of that study that was requested by the state legislative committee was to have that done by December of 2021. That didn't happen, and it's basically been delayed a year. So that's why we're moving forward. But there was this delay because we were hoping, we basically didn't want the committee to be evaluating this and recommend something that, if the state statutes on SDCs were going to change. So just a reminder of why we did the pause. And unfortunately, I don't have anything new to share at the state level, but we did provide some additional information on how other cities are dealing with deferrals and credits and various things. So at least we have that to consider as we move forward with this discussion this afternoon. So with that, I think it's already been stated about the rate, the SDC update was about looking at the revised project list and the level of the SDCs with respect to the new projects, but it was also about how you assess the charges, and were you going to make any changes to the way you charge the SDCs for single family, multifamily, or commercial development. Summarized here and by Scott about you're still going to do a scaled SDC for single family residential structures. so that smaller homes will pay less, larger homes will pay more. And that analysis was informed by an in-depth statistical analysis looking at the relationship between water use and the size of the home. The committee selected one of three options. And so the numbers that I'm presenting this afternoon all reflect that, that option. For multifamily, based on the analysis, and the committee's discussion, was decided that the multifamily is based on a uniform cost per dwelling unit. So this table,
All right, quick question.
yes.
Sorry, Deb. Sean Moran, thank you.
Hi, Sean.
Hey, the 3,000 square foot kind of upper breakpoint, what would that mean for valuation? Would that be like a $300,000 house on the single family side? What would that equate to?
Oh, I'm not really the one to answer that. I'm not
Okay.
a builder developer.
Okay.
um,
I just wondered if that was part of this structure around the methodology on how that was looked at.
No, we don't, the SDCs aren't assessed based on the value of the home. They're assessed based on the impact that the home is estimated to have on the infrastructure system, whichever system that is.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
One
So
of the
this,
things, just real
yeah,
quick,
go
we
ahead,
did
Scott.
as part of this, that Deb did, is this regression analysis where they looked at the size of homes and the permitted size of homes and actually compared that to water usage citywide for all the single family residential houses that we have information on. And that's where she came up with a couple breakpoints to look at, where basically past the 3,000 square foot marker, your water consumption reduces as in relation to the size of your home. So you keep building larger, your water usage diminishes, it doesn't increase at the same rate up to 3,000 square foot. So that's one of the things we've done to update this methodology moving forward, is to account for the actual size of home and its impact directly on the system itself.
Correct, good. So having made those decisions, not to revisit those decisions, just wanted to kind of, since it's been a while, just kind of reflect on those again. And to mention that these numbers now reflect that 3,000 square foot breakpoint, no baseline for single family, for illustrating the SDC phasing options. So we've got the two different systems. We've got water and we've got drainage, also referred to as stormwater. And as you probably are aware, we're in an inflationary period. And so the other thing we did is to update the numbers to reflect the inflation that's occurred over the last year, since we had developed the numbers earlier in 2021. And so now that basically a year has passed since the numbers were initially developed, we've updated the SDCs to reflect the 2022 inflation. So it's now current as of January of 2022. The statutes allow cities to, once the methodology is adopted, to just apply an annual inflationary adjustment to the SDCs that are adopted. And so, but we don't want to start out of the gate being behind and not accounting for the inflation that's occurred. So that's why you see now two lines of numbers, and these numbers are slightly changed since our last meeting. And the inflation was pretty significant based on the Engineering News Record Construction Cost Index, which tracks inflation on a monthly basis. So the 2021 costs are similar to what we discussed at the last meeting, but they do reflect the 3,000 breakpoint and no baseline. And then the 2022 inflation adjusted numbers include that additional inflation that's occurred over the last year. So then you've got two phasing options. And this is for the water, it's based on the water treatment plant project list. The council will make a final determination about what the project list will ultimately look like. But for illustration of a phasing option, we're looking at obviously the SDC that would increase and therefore would need consideration of phasing or not. So the committee, when we last met, looked at two options: a 2-year, an immediate, there you don't have to phase, obviously. So one option is just put it in place in 1 year. And then the two phasing options are phase in equal amounts in 2 years or over 3 years. And so you can see the results of those for a typical single family home in the first column. And then you can see, so based on the adjusted numbers, the current updated SDC is 6351. And if you phase that in over 2 years, the first year would be 5639, and then it would go to 6351. And if you did it over 3 years, the first year would be a couple $100 lower. And then, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I'm following this chart. And what I'm understanding is that we have what you've just explained is for water. And then you have an 1890 square foot cost basis for water, but you're using a 3,000 square foot single family basis for drainage. I'm assuming to get the 1890 square foot, I would use the multiplier and cost per square foot.
So the 3,000 square feet is impervious surface. So it includes, yeah, so it's all impervious surfaces of a single family lot, which the city determined that wasn't a number that we modified. It's just what the city has.
It's not the size of the dwelling, it's impervious
exactly
surface. So with
yes.
1,890 square foot typical single family dwelling would be paying 6351 for water and 2216 for drainage.
You are correct.
Okay, then my second follow-up question is, I understand the inflationary cost in the water, and we've probably talked about this, but it's been a long time. Tell me why things are going from $507 to $2216 for drainage.
In part because it hasn't been updated since 2002, and water was updated, I think, in 2015 or something, much more recently than the storm drain. So, I mean, it's the costs are way off, and the city just completed a new master plan, and the project list and the capacity increasing projects identified in that plan form the basis for the SDC.
All right, so that's where the wastewater treatment plant costs are getting factored in?
Not a wastewater treatment plant for the drainage.
The water, sorry, okay. All
Yeah,
right.
the water is being factored into the water SDCs, George. Correct.
And the difference in drainage is just because we haven't updated it since 2002.
That's part of it. And part of it is because you have a new master plan that has identified the costs, the projects, which are needed to expand capacity in the system to accommodate, among other things, new development.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sean has a question too, Deb.
Sorry, I'll make I'll make it quick.
That's
You know,
fine.
I'm looking at this water and then the drainage, and then I'm relating it to a 2019 study session where it was about building fees that the planning department gave for the city council. And it showed that a 2,000 square foot house proposed in 2019, the total SDCs was $13,930. But when I add the water and the drainage with the 22 inflation adjusted number, it comes to 8,567. So that's, you know, roughly a 50% difference. So why would, what am I missing? Why is it 8560? And when I look at that 2019 study session on SDC totals, it says it's nearly 14,000.
There's, go ahead, Brandon.
I was going to say that typically when we provide what the SDCs are for a single family home, we also include the systems development charge for parks and the system development charge for transportation. So that may be the difference that you're seeing, that this is not all in. It's not including transportation and parks on the chart that Deb
Or
is-
wastewater also, right?
Well, yeah, there's 5 of them, so it'd be wastewater as well.
Mhm.
So I think it's kind of, we have to look at it all, don't we? I mean, holistically, right? We can't just, we can't just look at one or two. And if there's, especially now that you said there's 5, I mean, that's a massive difference. So are those going up proportionally as well, relative to the current number here that we see? No.
The committee, many of these members did the update for the transportation a couple of years ago. And so that's already been, that was adopted and is in place. And there's, other than kind of inflationary increases, not a need to change that until there's a new transportation system plan or the city identifies some, you know, new improvement. So it's usually triggered by an update of the system plan, other than just keeping pace with ongoing inflation. And I'm not sure about the parks and the wastewater. Scott, you can address.
The wastewater was adopted, you know, previously to the transportation SDC getting updated. Deb worked on the transportation and wastewater. The wastewater wasn't changed from when it was last done in 2014, I believe. Transportation was modified slightly in 2017, I want to say, based on a second look at the system development charges that were modified originally back in 2013-14 as well. So there was a second look at the transportation system charges and they changed them. The council adopted a new methodology in 2017, I believe. So those were kind of refreshed back then. And, you know, as Deb said, the reason we're looking at storm drain and water currently as part of this process is because we have a new storm drain master plan and a new water master plan that were recently completed. And so that's kind of the appropriate time to look at your SDCs and update your methodology and your charging, and take into account, you know, policy direction and changes and regulatory changes as well, for supporting, you know, policy-driven developments that we've kind of talked about before and mentioned, you know, multifamily housing and supporting multifamily housing. And so we changed, and the recommendation in this is to, you know, change the multifamily SDC to a dwelling unit instead of a square footage size to support that. And then we'll also, in a little bit, talk about deferrals and cost collection as well to support, you know, what we believe is the policy direction. The other thing I just want to clarify real quick is the square footage that we're talking about. Those are just reference square footages to give you an idea of the charge. The 1,890 square foot was developed as the average size home permitted in Ashland. Over the last 5 years, Deb, is what you looked at?
Yeah, it's based on very more recent data. Yeah.
Actual data. And then the 3,000 square foot is an assumed impervious area number in the storm drain master plan for the average development in Ashland is assumed to have about 3,000 square foot of impervious area. So this just gives you a conceptual charge of what it would be.
Terrific. Yeah, so just for clarity's sake, you're saying that the difference, which is $5,360 roughly, it would be from the parks, the transportation, and the wastewater SDC increases. Is that correct?
Correct,
Okay.
correct.
Except that, well, the only thing I would say is that, you have to compare that to the current. So the current water is the 4,900 roughly, and then 500 for the drainage. So about 5,500, call it. That the difference between the 14,000 that you're referring to and the 5,000 is what the other systems are. These because these numbers are based on 2022, so wouldn't have been reflected in that 2019 estimate.
So you're saying that 14,000 would be higher? based
Oh,
on-
sure,
Right.
yeah.
So it would be the difference between 4927 and 62351 and 507 and 2216 for single families, correct? Which is
Sorry,
1,500 plus, so it's additional $3,000 roughly is what?
Oh, if you're taking the delta between the current
Yes.
water and
Yes.
drainage and the
Yes.
22, yes, correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Plus whatever the other three SDCs have gone up as a
Right.
result of annual increases.
Exactly right.
So all I'm saying is that it's 14,000 in 2019. That would be whatever happens with water, wastewater, and transportation is what it is. But it would be 14,000 plus the difference, the increases which are being cited here. For
Correct.
SDCs in total. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I don't know if there's any other questions on this table, or if you want to discuss right now the phasing or not. We're ultimately looking for a recommendation from the committee about whether to move forward with the full amount of the updated SDC or to phase in over 2 or 3 years. The next items of our discussion, other than just to show you, here's what the updated commercial water SDCs are with the inflation, and the phasing would work the same for commercial in that the existing or the adjusted for the smallest meter size is the same as the single family. So if you say, let's split over 2 years, then all of these numbers would, their increases would be split over 2 years as well. So what's the preference, Scott, or do you think discuss this now, or?
Yeah, if
move
the
on?
committee would like to discuss it now, I think it's a good time, because then we can answer questions that come up as well. I know you guys had a discussion about it, but there was no decision made at the last meeting because the group was interested in looking at the code as well as part of the process. So we never formalized a recommendation on the phasing, yes or no.
That would require code change, is that correct?
No, the phasing would not. It would just be part of the resolution and the methodology update.
All right. There was some mention in the report about code changes, but not having to do it.
I would like to, sorry, on the slide that you were just on, Deb.
Yep.
Can you, or Scott, very quickly remind us, if you have already told us, why are the percentage variations all over the map?
Yeah, sure. So the other thing that, and again, it has been a while since we talked about this. So one of the things that we discussed at one of the last meetings was that the factors that relate these larger meters back to the smallest meter size are outdated. They don't follow current industry practice. And so the factors, I've updated the factors to reflect industry standard. And what that meant is that you actually see some of the meter sizes go down relative to what they're charged today. So that's particularly true for the 4-inch and the 2-inch most significantly. So the standard approach is to base an SDC for a non-residential customer based on its meter size, because it's a predictor of the capacity that's in the system, the infrastructure that's needed to serve them. And it's information that's available at the time of development. You don't have water usage history because it's a new customer. And so it's very common, and I'd say the most common approach is to use meters, the size of the meter, and then to charge a multiplier basically on anything over the smallest meter size based on the hydraulic equivalency. So those have been updated to reflect those equivalencies, and it did have kind of varying effects on the meter sizes.
So going back to our 1890 square foot typical Ashland house is a 3/4 inch pipe, I assume?
Well, so this is a different, so it's, well, Scott, I mean, usually it's 5/8 by 3/4 or 3/4. The 3/4 is generally oftentimes the new standard, but the SDCs for the homes, of course, are not going to be based on the meter size. It's going to be based on the square footage. But you've got all of these meter sizes in the system. I think 5/8 by 3/4 is the most common.
Yeah, and 3/4, as you said, Deb, is the new standard. So I guess to try to think about this is, on the residential side, it's charged per square footage on a square footage basis for your SDC. On the commercial side, it's charged essentially on your meter size, which drives the amount of water that you can pass through to your system. So you have to make a formal decision on the meter size based on your use in that commercial sector as part of that. So you often see that people will really formalize the commercial meter size that's just adequate enough to meet their need. And you will see some oversize for potential future use as well. And so the factors that Deb is talking about are based on industry standards, and that's what she updated those comparatives to that reduce or increase the charges. So it's you're paying for the potential capacity or actual capacity.
Got it. Thank you.
And we did we did a lot of research on the communities around you just to make sure that to test to see how the commercial SDCs compared. And in a number of cases, your commercial SDCs for these other meters that are now going down were way higher than what the other communities. So this brings you into alignment with industry standard and with the surrounding communities.
Sean?
Yeah, well, again, I'm going to reference back to that 2019 building fee report, and it actually quite clearly shows where Ashland stands both on the single family, multifamily, and the commercial. You're right, there are several that are higher. I mean, Medford's is higher. But I mean, there are several, including Jackson County, where Ashland sticks out as just in the SDC side of it, quite high. And when you add in the permits for building and the additional miscellaneous fees, we're astronomically more expensive than everyone else. But that's another conversation. My question on the commercial side, I think presented to council was that over the last 10 years, there's only been 50 commercial permits pulled. Is that accurate? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is when we did an assessment with Fregonesi and Associates
Yes.
of commercial permits. So
Yes.
yes, I think there
Okay.
might have been smaller permits that weren't included on that. We were really isolating to new square footage that was added,
Okay.
but that's what applies to the STCs as
Okay,
well.
it was kind of what Deb had mentioned. I'm curious to know, how common a 5/8 is versus a 6-inch pipe. Of those 50 permits, were 10 of them 6-inch pipes. I mean, what are the numbers associated with those kind of people interested in building commercial with a 3/4 inch pipe versus a 4-inch pipe? You know what I mean? So are there numbers that you can attach so we can have some idea about what we're talking about in general? Because to me, it would make it easier to conceptualize really, what the market is and what we're talking about, what kind of interest there is. I mean, if there's only one commercial permit that pulled a 6-inch pipe, I mean, it doesn't seem to add a lot of value. So that's kind of where I'm getting. Do you have that data? Can we add that? That's the question. Thank you.
I don't think we have it tonight. We can certainly provide that to council when
Yeah.
we take
Don't
it
need it
forward.
tonight, but I think it'd be helpful for everyone to know to conceptualize what we're talking about as far as numbers.
Sure.
Thank you.
Those are some pretty big meters. I'll say that. So I would be surprised if you have very many of them.
Yeah, I mean, my gut tells me that we're 2-inch and smaller for, I'd say 95% of what goes on in Ashland. And that would include the capacity for sprinkling a building as well, as part of this. So we very rarely see anything bigger than 2-inch. The school districts, are the ones that would have 3 or 4-inch for total capacity, but most commercial development would have something significantly smaller.
No, I get that. And that's kind of the gist of my question. If no one is building with a 4-inch meter, we could say the SDCs are 0, there would be no interest. So that's kind of what I'm getting to. Right? So thank you.
I think Bob's got a question.
Yeah, mixed use falls under commercial meters, doesn't it?
Maybe Brandon can answer how you handle those now.
Yeah, I think that if the mixed use has apartments under the new methodology, we'd be in a position to assess a per unit for these specific STCs. I know transportation and parks are also based on the residential units, but the commercial space would have a water meter size associated with that square footage that would be collected as an STC for the commercial use portion.
So you'll be putting commercial meters and residential meters on the same building, or you'll be charging differently?
I think you would be charged based on the water meter size for the commercial space and then charged on a per unit basis for the residential.
Because right now, they're charging residential on a commercial rate in a mixed use building.
Yeah, we'd have to look up a specific building that you have in mind and I could see how it was charged.
Okay, I'll send you a bill.
Yeah.
But it's not uncommon to do it that way but as Brandon said, if you've got a per unit charge for residential, you can do that portion that way. If there's going to be one meter that serves the whole mixed use, then some consideration would need to go into, okay, what would the meter be just to serve the commercial use, so that you're not charging both for the meter within the meter capacity for the units, as well as through the unit per unit charge.
Simple question. Do we charge more for commercial water than we do for residential water? Or is it the same cost per gallon or whatever?
On the SDCs, it's the same cost per, in this case, yeah, exactly, per
Okay.
gallon.
So when
I don't know about the rates.
So when we're calculating this charge, the cost is somehow equalized. We just do it on square footage for residential and on the size of the pipe for commercial.
Yes.
Thank you.
Deb, can I I just want to understand. So the most common water meter size for commercial are between 5/8 and 2 inches. Is that accurate? That's the vast majority of those commercial.
Oh, yeah, I would think so. And I think that's what Scott had said as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
most of them are going to be
I
under
think I might
2
be able to
inches.
illuminate that. I've been doing a search in our permitting software, which only goes back to March of 2018. But in that period of time, there was one permit that had a 4-inch meter, 4 permits that had a 2-inch meter, and then the remainder were all less than that. And the 4-inch meter was related to Walker School, so a large project, and no 6-inch meters.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was kind of thinking if you did a weighted average of 5/8 through the 2 inches, you would see that the 22 inflation adjusted would suggest an increase of 15 to 20% for the commercial as well. So anyway, that's kind of what I was trying to figure out. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions on this, or shall we move on to the next topic?
Are we gonna make a recommendation on phasing? Or just
Oh.
get-
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I have one. I'd like to, I know you recommended phasing broken down in 1 or 2 years, if that's right.
Those are the options that we
Yeah, the
presented.
options. You know, I'm okay with that. My concern is the rentals. And I don't agree with 1 or 2 years for rentals as far as these water and drainage fees are concerned. Once again, it goes back to the return on the investment in rental properties and for sale properties. So if you look at the, if we're talking about building a commercial building or a subdivision, let's take a subdivision and we'll take some apartments. When you look at the fees, the recovery of that cost for a subdivision is 1 or 2 years. For apartment buildings, recovery is 30 years. And just to give some preliminary values, you'll get a return on your investment on a sale of a home or a condo in any mix, subdivision or condominium building, of 45 to 100% return on your investment. If you build an apartment building, the return on that investment is less than 5% the first year or 2 years. So there's no quid pro quo here. The bills, the charges are the same, but the returns are totally different. And if we're thinking about incentivizing apartments and rental housing, we got to think about the charges and the costs and the recovery of those costs. You're not going to have people building apartments if they're going to be charged the same amount of money that a developer is building is getting when they build a subdivision or condos. It's just not equal. So my recommendation is to spread these fees out over the period of recovery, 30 to 40 years. And that would be for rental housing and for owner occupied housing, if it's a build and keep situation. The other ones is I agree, 1 or 2 years is fine as far as phasing.
So I think, Bob, to your point, I think we want to talk about, and this is where we're going to get into the next phase of this discussion, is deferrals and collection of charge. And that process, based on your discussion and our interpretation of what you mentioned at the previous meeting, we think we can account for that issue and the collection of charge, how the collection of charge is phased, and when the deferral point starts. Right now, you know, you can only, you pay upon issuance of a permit, And so we have some discussion moving forward about when that deferral process and how that would work, and when collection of charge would start based on different occupation types for multifamily, residential, et cetera, as part of the next phase of the discussion. So right now we're just looking at, do we want to phase in the SDC period? And then we want to discuss and take recommendations from the committee on deferrals and the collection of charge. And we have a couple of examples of that Deb will go through when we get to that point for the committee to absorb and discuss.
That's good, because I got a response for that. I just didn't know which one I should get first.
Yeah, and I just want to point out this multifamily column here shows that even with the inflation adjusted at the 2887, and that's a flat charge per dwelling unit, no matter the size of the dwelling unit,
Mhm.
and based on a typical 1,000 square foot dwelling unit, that increase is less than $300, whereas so much less significant than for a typical single family home. So it's just important to consider in terms of the phasing. So even if you split that over 3 years and say, okay, we're going to add $100 a year, that's a big difference than the phasing on the single family, which is phasing in, and it would be phasing in an increase of $1,300 roughly per unit for a typical size. So the multifamily has a significantly less lower increase than single family. But separate discussion, as Scott said, about even if you raise the SCC to 2887 immediately, when is that payment due, and over how much time can you finance that or defer the payment?
Just a point of clarification, I think a distinction between the STC phasing options and part of what you're discussing, Bob, is that by 2024 or 2025, depending on when this got approved, we'd be up to the full cost. It's only phasing in for these first 3 years to really attempt to look at that large increase and spread it out over time. But if somebody applied for a building permit in 2026, there's no phasing associated with it anymore. That makes sense.
So I understand that there's 2 points here, and one is what the rate is and how we're going to phase it in. And then to Bob's point is the deferral and when you actually have to pay it based on whether you're multifamily or single family. And so I will voice that these are significant increases. Given the state of the world and the cost of construction right now, I would favor phasing these in over 3 years. It appears to me that a lot of this is based on cost that is for future construction, and which may or may not all occur, certainly not within the next 3 years. And I think phasing in this level of an increase is the appropriate approach. I'll move that we adopt a 3-year phase in according to this chart.
I'll second that, but I have a question for Scott about how this affects his budget.
So just in general, Dave, how,
Yeah. What's the phase in due to the money that you have, that you have for project work?
I can't say that it has a huge impact one way or the other. As part of what we have is each project has a certain apportioned SDC share, and it's like 15%, 25%, all the way up to potentially 100%. So a lot of the projects, we either use what SDC cash on hand we have to pay when we pay all cash using existing balance, or when we borrow, we'll borrow 10, 15, 20 years, and the SDC payment is amortized in that same 5, 10, 15, 20% capacity into that loan payment. So it's not a real negative impact as far as collection and the ability to pay for debt moving forward or to pay using cash on hand. My critical thing, and I think I've mentioned this before, is the need to look at these regularly and update them, and also update them to account for inflation. Because like we talked about, when you have the storm drain one that's 20 years old and hasn't been touched, you've been under recouping storm drain SDCs for that whole time, essentially. And that's where you fall behind. And I think, Deb, we even found that out when the transportation system SDCs were updated as well, because they weren't indexed and they weren't updated since 1998, I think it was. So again, you've under recouped in those, and that's where you fall behind. So it's good to be consistent. So we have a first and second. Are there any other questions or discussion? Hearing none, can we get a thumbs up on the motion from everybody? Okay. All right. All approved.
Okay,
Do you want
Next
to
topic.
motion on the commercial water SD
the phasing applies in the same way.
in the same way? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that
okay.
it is a good question, though, in terms of you could say, well, you should go ahead. Well, I don't know, that might get kind of complicated. I was going to say, you could say the ones that are going down could just go down, but that might get confusing for, so I guess there is a question on the table of, do you do all of the, phase them all over 3 years, or do you just do the ones that are increasing over 3 years?
No, I'd suggest you phase in the increases and apply the decreases immediately.
Does that work?
Motion?
That's how I would move it forward. I wouldn't phase in the decrease.
Is that a motion, Dave?
That would be a motion.
Okay.
I will second that motion.
Deb, thank you for raising that.
Yeah, thank you for asking the question, because I hadn't really thought about that
Yeah.
before. So yeah, good clarification.
Any discussion on this one from anybody? Thumbs up? Thank you, everybody. All right.
Okay, moving on to time of payment. And as was stated, separate issue from whatever the SDC that's in effect at the time. When is it now going to be due for payment? Current policy is that it's due at the time of the building or development permit. Affordable housing may defer the SDC indefinitely, as long as the property then isn't sold to a non-affordable qualifying affordable housing use. So the deferral options, and this is based, we did do collect information from other communities to see what other codes speak to on this issue. And this would require a code change if you were going to recommend a change. That single family sometimes is a deferral option is provided for time of sale or actual occupancy, whichever comes first, and other types of development at the certificate of occupancy, time of sale, or occupancy. Again, whichever comes first. There are some communities who have implemented deferral programs that have criteria that you have to meet. For example, in Bend, it's only eligible for multifamily because special consideration was given to multifamily for reasons that have been discussed. And Medford has put some boundaries, I guess, around these deferrals with respect to the value of the development. It doesn't, again, the value doesn't play into how much is owed. It just is a consideration in whether there can be any deferral. So if it's over a $500,000 project, no deferral, partial deferral if it's 250 to 500, and so anything under 250 then I think is eligible for deferral. Generally, there are fees associated with this because it takes time to administer the program. Those fees aren't generally significant in the context of the SDC charge. And generally those are located in the city's fee schedule and can be modified from time to time based on cost increases. And there may be interest charges if those if fees are deferred over, you know, a long period of time.
I think George has got a question, Deb.
Yeah, go ahead, George.
Deb, not to disagree, but in looking at the Medford program on page 28 of our packet, I don't think it's the value of the development. I think it's the value of the STCs.
You're right. Yes,
And
correct.
so-
Thank you for that.
Yeah, because if you deferred things that were less than 500K, there wouldn't be a lot to defer.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the summary of the deferral issue or the timing of the payment. Is it due at the building permit? Or do you wait until occupancy or a time of sale? Those are some of the considerations, which is different than, again, from financing. So you can say, okay, well, it's due at the time of occupancy or it's due at the time of permit, but I want to finance it over 10 or 20 years. And so that's another separate policy decision. And so I just want to make that clear that you really have to make a decision on both of those items. The current policy on the financing is that up to 10 years, number of payments, and the interest rate is fixed and varies depending on the years of the loan. So if a shorter loan has a lower interest rate slightly. So then there are other communities that, like Medford has a potentially longer 40-year, or sorry, 20-year with semi-annual payments and interest rates that are set annually. All development is eligible. Bend has a 20 semi-annual, so 10-year period for loans, same interest rates. And Eugene and Redmond, they tie their interest rates to the prime rate, and then Eugene adds 2%, Redmond adds 2.5%. So, so these are other options that can be considered. All of them do charge an interest rate. So you can finance and therefore defer a portion of the payment, I guess. But in this case, you're going to pay for the interest that accrues as you would with any other loan. And so two separate discussion items for the committee.
We got a question from Sean and then a follow-up from Brandon.
Thank you. Yeah. So on the idea of collection, I mean, if you can go out and borrow money, you can buy a 5-year T-bill at 1.85%. You can buy a 10-year T-bill at 2%. So, and even you can get a 15-year mortgage at JP Morgan for 3.5%. Why would you borrow it from the city at 6% or 7%? I mean, who in God's name would do that? That's I don't want to be cynical, but it seems a little bit, that seems self-defeating in the sense that, you know, if you would charge that, no one would do it anyway. So if we're taking a carrot and stick approach where we're saying, okay, we're going to increase fees, but we're going to make it so we want you to do we want the business, so we'll finance it with, you know, much more competitive rate. Why wouldn't we do that? To me, to see that is kind of an explanation to me as to why things don't seem to be happening. And I get the other communities have their rates as well, but they see more growth than we do. So I don't know, is there an answer to that? Does that make sense what I said? Because, you know, as a finance guy, I mean, it kind of, the cost of money will go where the cost of money is cheapest. And if you're assessing a fee, which I get, and I think maybe that's the smart way to do it, you could have a higher set fee, but a lower interest rate. So, you know, it makes it feasible for people to finance these things.
Yeah, and I can't speak to how that rate was established in the code. I don't have the history of that, but I do agree that, you know, and Deb and I talked about this, is, you know, what other communities are doing with a prime rate plus, you know, a little bit of overhead potentially, or the prime rate, and then you look at an administrative fee, because from the city standpoint, you still have to manage that collection of the charge, you know, so there's administrative overhead associated with that. So how you build that is part of the process. And I do think that charge based on today's market and borrowing is not beneficial at all.
Yeah, I mean, we just went through a period in modern American financial history where the cost of money has never been cheaper. Okay, so to go out and say, hey, you can finance your project for the next 10 years at 7%, where they're giving money away, no one's going to do it. So, Scott, could you come back to maybe this committee or even the council with some kind of way that would, you know, what I'm trying to say is we're going to people and saying, hey, we're going to increase the SDC fees. You know, honestly, I don't support that. But if that's the goal, then maybe it's a carrot and the stick, and we say, hey, you can go out and you can finance these projects much more reasonably, and you can math it out. It makes sense. But 6-7%, I mean, no one's going to do that anyway. So does that make sense?
George? Yeah, and I think part of the discussion for this is to get some recommendations from the committee to have rate adjustments and have term periods adjusted per the code, to allow a bit of flexibility that we can bring forward to the council.
What I was going to say is I don't think that the city's interest rate is really the important part of this discussion. If any of you want to borrow money at 7%, give me a call. I'm happy to do it. I think the important part is creating a deferral option, and to give people the opportunity to borrow money or not is up to them. But that creating the deferral option is what's really the more important part of this discussion, not the interest rate.
So the one point I was going to raise was in the subsequent chart that you have, Deb, the one component of our collection of charge that isn't noted is that we also offer a 1-year installment loan at 0% interest, provided that those charges are paid in full at certificate of occupancy, time of sale, or within 1 year. So that is really the very short term 0%. And in terms of the 6 and 7%, Sean, you know, I was party to that, working with Paula Brown when those numbers were established. It was in part looking at other communities, and having a rate that is much higher than prime rate was in some way intended to offset cost of living or cost increases of inflation over time.
Mm.
Unlike a loan that you might take where you're getting a loan at prime plus over a 30-year period, obviously you'll get a better interest rate than the city, who doesn't necessarily want to loan the money and then have to collect it in the future and pay a higher cost for those goods and services at the front end.
I completely understand, and I appreciate what George said. I agree with him. I'm just saying, when you stack it all up against why people do things or don't do things, a 7% rate is going to be a factor as well. So, I mean, the deferral option is the gold standard, and I think that is super important. Yeah, you know, George said 7%. I'll lend money at 4.5. So we'll just go for that. Floating rate, actually. Thank you.
I'll go 4. Well, can I recommend that let's try to bifurcate this conversation. The current policy is all SDCs are due at development permit. Is anybody on the committee think that we ought to maintain that policy for all building permit? Or for all development permits, sorry.
What's the question?
Does anybody think we should maintain the existing policy of no deferments on SDC charges with all of them being due at the time you pull a building permit? I do not favor that.
No, I think I brought attention to that a number of times. I sent Scott, did you get your email?
I did.
I sent you a motion on this, and it kind of covers what we've been talking about.
Yeah,
Well,
You can bring it up,
what
but
I'm trying to do is divide the discussion between single family and multifamily. Because I think that's an issue. And I don't know whether we want the same policy for everybody or not.
well, I think you got two things there, George. You got single family for a homeowner that's building a house. You've got single family for someone that's building a house that's a rental. And then you've got single family that's a for-profit sale. And you have to draw a distinction between all three of those, because that's where the fairness option comes in. Because when you're deferring it, it seems reasonable that you would defer it when it's a rental property. You would defer it, whatever the term may be, for a homeowner that's building a new house. And you would defer it when you're building a house that would be a rental. And as I read the picture, and I have been reading the studies in this city for the last 20 years, we're always underwater on rentals. And why? There's no incentives. Everything is skewed against rental property. My idea is to defer rental properties out. There's no reason to be paying them in advance. Disincentivizes any kind of construction. Any of these, there's no reason to defer a fee for sale products because the rewards are instantaneous. I don't know if that answers your question about deferring them, but I just think there's three different types of deferments when we talk about single family households or single family or for rents.
Well, so I am entirely in favor of coming up with some way to incentivize multifamily construction and multifamily rental construction. I am less interested in providing benefit to single family construction, whether it's rental or owner occupied or for sale. I think we have enough single family construction in Ashland. It's pretty much all we ever build. And I think we need to the extent we can under the law, use system development charges and other city abilities to promote another kind of housing construction. I also think that trying to manage whether you build a house as a rental or whether you build a house for your own occupancy or your house for sale is going to be an incredible burden on the city. And I am also conscious of the fact that we have investors moving in who are buying huge numbers of existing housing and presumably could be building new housing for rental purposes. And that's not something I particularly want to incentivize.
I agree. I agree on that.
So ownership is kind of a messy thing for me. I think that we can only do so much. And I think multifamily, especially multifamily rental, is where I wanted to see the city providing some sort of an incentive and a deferral that, an extended deferral, I would totally support. I'm not quite there on single family dwelling.
Well, in that context, as far as single family rental on for profit, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I was just
Yeah.
looking at.
Yeah, and the affordable housing stuff is already deferred, right?
Yeah.
So, if Jackson County Housing Authority is building 60 single family rental units, there are single family houses, they're already getting a deferral option, correct?
Right.
Yeah, so ownership to me is, at this point, the benefit is for ownership, affordable nonprofit ownership is already built in. So I'd much rather talk about that, the kinds of houses that are being built, the kinds of dwellings.
I see Brandon's got a comment, and then I have a question that might be for Brandon or Bill, as part of administering a program change associated with the lines we're talking about. Brandon? So my question for Brandon or Bill then, so if we're talking about a deferral specifically for rental property, how do we administer that programmatically from the city side and ensure that the property is maintained as a rental? Would that be something similar to the deferral for low-income housing? Is there would have to be specific criteria and it would have to be met, and ownership of that rental or insurance that the property is actually being held and rented?
I think, Brandon, I think you might be muted, but Scott, I think we would have to look at some kind of similar, covenant, recorded on the property.
Okay.
Yeah, you would always have, if you have a recorded lien on there, you can always have in there any kind of notices and change in ownership. You'd be notified. That would be an automatic. Any kind of transfer of ownership, transfer of rights, repayments, debts, all those things you can put into your notes.
So for the group then, as I'm thinking about this and taking a little bit of what George said earlier about partitioning this, is we're now looking at partitioning multifamily and then multifamily rental as part of the deferral process. So, we're looking most locations and Deb's research and my research for just a multifamily, you can defer up to certificate of occupancy or sale as part of the option. So that could be a recommendation. And then look at the rental as a separate option for how to attack that and when that should be deferred. And we can kind of talk the logistics of that over a little bit, I think. And Brandon said his mic is giving him technology troubles.
So multifamily as distinct, just so that we're all clear, multifamily as distinct from multifamily rental is the difference between somebody developing a condominium project or a townhouse project. And they're all individual tax lots that are sold off to individual owners or rented or whatever within a year, to use Bob's timeframe, within a year or two of construction. Multifamily rental is an apartment building where a single entity is holding it for an extended period of time.
Right.
And, okay, so I don't have any problems with, again, to incentivize multifamily construction, which are smaller footprint, over single family. I don't have any problems with deferring that until occupancy, deferring those SDCs until occupancy. We could talk about whether or not you can borrow money and spread it out over 10 years or whatever, but it seems to me you're dealing with 50 different property owners. It's, you know, kind of a mess. I don't see why, if we truly want to incentivize apartments, rentals that are long-term held by a single entity, such as Bob is been discussing, I think we should come up with some way to treat that like affordable housing, but with a end date, you know, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is, or sale.
I'm wondering if there would be an interest in considering for multifamily, like the minimum development size. I mean, because George, as you're saying, you know, multifamily could be 2 or more units on one lot under the same owner. So that's, we do a lot of ARUs, single family with an ARU. I'm not sure that's really maybe what you're getting at versus middle housing on up.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bill. You know, defining what we mean by multifamily for this purpose, you know, some number of units or greater. You know, somebody builds a
What's the
duplex.
standard? What's the standard for a multifamily? Sorry to interrupt, but
In my experience, 4.
well, is there a disadvantage or an advantage to peg it at 4?
One comment I would have is that in our building permit software, 1 and 2 family is a specific permit type, and triplexes on up would be the multifamily. So if there is a breakpoint, the 1 and 2 family permit type would be readily, you know, addressed through the permit software. It's not to say we couldn't rebuild the permit software to have a third permit type, but for simplicity's sake, I would say multifamily is 3 units or greater on one property, and we could do 1 and 2 family under the ARUs or duplex and single family.
I think if we're, I mean, whatever the classification, so MFR in Ashland is 3 units, Brandon?
It used to be 2, but with the new state law that allows for duplexes and ARUs to be considered single family, I'm going to say that it's 3 at this point, that we would consider 3 units on one parcel, not independently owned, all under one ownership would be considered a multifamily development.
So I would just say MFR, residential rental properties, be under the category of deferred system development fees. And number 1, because we're providing rentable housing, which we don't have.
So walking through this, you're building a duplex, you're just treated like a single family and you pay your fee. You're building a triplex or larger, and you're going to retain it as a rental. You can defer your SDCs under some program we haven't yet defined. If you're building affordable housing, you are subject to the existing program under SDC. So we're talking about market rate or potentially market rate, multifamily construction under single ownership kept for rental purposes is what we're looking to incentivize. Have I got that right?
That's what it sounds like.
yeah, that's how I understood it.
So what should the incentive be?
What?
So you're talking about when should the payment be due?
Right.
Should it be in all of these cases, the latest that it's due, except for under the city's current affordable housing program. It's up to, the time of sale or occupancy, basically, is
Well-
which Brandon, I mean, you said that you've got a 1-year installment, 0 interest, which kind of works like a 1-year deferral for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, they'd have to execute an agreement with Public Works or with the city for that 1-year deferral at 0%.
I'm looking in Medford, Deb, that if you qualify for their program of deferral, you have 20 years to pay your SDCs, subject to a semi-annual payment with interest rate set annually.
See, then we're getting into the deferral versus financing. So that's, you're subject to, in financing, what kicks it into financing, I think, is that you have an interest payment due. Under most of these deferral programs, you pay a fee, but you don't have to, your SDC is not due. So there's, i.e. no need to finance, because it's not, we're just saying, we're going to kick it down to occupancy or sale or permit occupancy, and so there's no need for you to finance it over, the next year or two between when you get to pull the
Right.
permit and when you actually have occupants.
Is it
I
a
mean-
flat yearly fee or just a one-time fee?
Usually it's a one-time fee.
And it's a couple $100 from what I saw. So it's 150 to 600 bucks.
Yeah.
So-
But usually there is an agreement that has to be signed that
Yeah.
says, So-
Well, so essentially what I get out of that, that's great. I like that. I like the fact that essentially that's the city of Ashland saying, we really want to see, multifamily rental development. And we're going to forego some SDC pleasure if you build it. And you get that benefit until you sell it.
exactly.
I'm off with that. That sounds good to me.
Well, okay, so let's be clear on that. Most of these say to whatever comes first. So if it's occupied, I mean, if I'm building it and I am not selling it because I'm going to build it and then rent it or whatever, then there would be no sale that triggered it. It would be the occupancy of my tenants now moving in. That's when it would trigger when it was due. Then I have the choice to say, okay, but I don't want to pay it all up front. I want to finance it over 10 or 20 years. That's a separate discussion.
That's not as good of a deal.
Well, time value of money. And
Well, I think once you get into the interest discussion, you basically are putting owners in the position of just getting a separate note or adding it to their larger mortgage,
yes, you're
which I don't
absolutely
think is
right.
what Bob is promoting, even though the cost of money is so cheap right now.
Yeah, because you're asking the city to take on, risk and inflation in foregoing collecting the money up front. And
Well,
so
I'm just thinking that the city of Ashland, for the 40 years that I've lived here, has pretty much been a single family residential development based community. And this is perhaps an opportunity to come up with a true incentive, a financial incentive to encourage a different kind of development. We do it for affordable housing. Maybe we need to do it for workforce rentals too, that are privately owned.
good policy questions.
How does everyone feel about those ideas?
So George and Bob, are we partitioning that, what I'll call a true incentive, only towards rental? It's kind of what I'm getting at is what you guys are talking about
Rentals.
versus, owner owned or sold, which we're just deferring until occupancy is kind of where we're headed.
Yeah, I mean, the for sale component, the incentive is the profit. You're going to build a for sale product if you have a deferred SD system development charges or not.
Yeah.
What we don't have and what we're not doing is building apartments. There has to be incentives. This is one incentive. What I'm proposing is deferring it for a period of time at a rate that's basically a market rate that you would get at any commercial lender. I think what I'm proposing is basically, well, we'll get there when we get to that point. But anyhow, yeah, we're talking about rentals only. If there was a way to incentivize, workforce housing or rental rates, I don't know if everybody wants to go that deep. But I mean, you can go that deep. I mean, you could structure it to where if you're offering properties at 100% of the median income levels of the community, your incentives are greater. If you're providing, rental housing at market rates, which is well above median income levels, that's a whole different rate. I think there's different levels that you can incentivize.
Yeah, and I think, George, you said it, it's development of a structure that's similar to our low-income housing program, where you can control it. So can I share my screen for a sec? And I'll throw up what Bob was referencing. Here. And Bob's covering the collection of charge and the deferral associated with the collection of charge. So I think as far as a deferral for rental property, we're talking about, Bob, number 9, the first installment is due upon stabilization at year number 2, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
So
typically, what that means is you're not going to get a full occupancy on an apartment building and anything, typically a year. So it takes a good year to stabilize an apartment building. And by stabilization, I'm talking about 96, 90%, 97% occupancy. So you got that rent up period. So I'm talking about starting in year 2.
Okay. And then the rest of these are associated, in my mind, how I read it, with the collection of charge, your payment period, your annual installments, the rate adjustment, and no fees. And then we'd have to develop some sort of restrictive covenant on the rental itself to ensure compliance, that it stays as a rental for that period. Otherwise, just like low income housing, it would come back to normal and you would have to pay the full SDC.
Yeah, and these terms and everything, I mean, isn't something I pulled out of my hat. They're basically, terms of financial institutions, spread to all commercial developers, commercial loans, etc. So they're kind of uniform. It's not something that you have to regurgitate and come up and figure what we're going to pay. It's easy to pick the number every 5 years. You know what the rate is. I'm calling it an assumable, and I also put on here, make sure that the city's protected by making sure the debts never exceed certain levels.
Yes, that's good. Yeah.
Assumable, Bob, means that like Joe sells it to Mike, but it's still a rental. It's still singly owned.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that doesn't, that could be, basically it's a sale, it's a transfer. So what I'm really kind of hit on there is a transfer, and you could call it, and everyone's going to call it a sale. But I'm leaving it as a sale, but it would be a transfer. So it could be a transfer. I mean, it could be a transfer to a nonprofit entity.
So it sounds like that in the language that we were trying to use in the slides and and suggesting that there's really two components here. One is the deferral. It sounds like from this that number 9 addresses the deferral. Basically, you're saying nothing is due until year 2. So and then there's a financing agreement that is based on an interest rate that's tied to the 10-year T-bill plus margin, and from there. So there's a deferment and then there's a financing, right? Okay,
Correct.
great. Thank you.
Yeah, and just for clarification, we're talking about financing, but the city is not financing anything. You know, we're not giving anybody money. We're giving someone the ability to pay us over an amortized financing period. Is
Correct.
part of this. Yes.
Just one thing on number 5, interest rate is based on a 10-year treasury bill plus 300 basis points.
Yeah.
3 basis
Okay.
points would be 2%. So we want
Sorry.
a floating rate plus 300 bips, 300 basis points.
Sorry.
No, it's all good.
Well, I got to tell you, this is not as far as I would go. I think this is a pretty reasonable proposal. Essentially, this amounts to a 2-year deferment to allow somebody that builds a rental to conserve their capital and get it ramped up and fully occupied before they have to start paying the SDCs. And that seems to me like a really low bar for the city to invest in an effort to encourage this kind of construction.
Great first step.
So I guess as far as process, you know, do we want to break it into, again, multifamily and then multifamily rental, and have the multifamily just be an occupancy is the maximum deferred period, and then as a recommendation to bring this information forward to the council as part of our future discussion with the council about changes associated specifically with rental properties, multifamily rental.
So yes, I would move that we propose that multifamily multifamily SDCs be deferred until the time of occupancy. And we would further recommend to council that they adopt a policy to defer multifamily multifamily rentals, subject to all of these parameters, for 2 years from the date of occupancy.
I second that.
Any other discussion, questions?
Scott,
Sean?
as someone who's going to be in the middle of this, what do you think about this?
My only concern is the 40-year time period for payment. I would probably be looking at recommending, you know, a 20-year time frame. And we just get into an administrative issue with tracking over the long term. You know, most of our stuff has been tracked over 10 years. And I'll just reference back in the day, it was tracked through a DOS program for our LID program. And then the person who managed that DOS program went away. And then it became a nightmare to try to unwrap that tangle and put it in a new data collection system. So as far as the administration of city business, you know, we change softwares and programs occasionally, and porting things over and tracking becomes a logistical issue sometimes. So having a shorter time period associated with the total payback, I would recommend that over the 40-year time period. And then there's various ways to skin the cat, as you guys have talked about the interest rate. And I definitely think that, you know, we should tie it to something more tangible than just a random 6 or 7% moving forward as part of that policy. And whether that be, you know, prime plus an amount, prime plus nothing, but you have administrative fees, or you tie it to prime and then it's indexed per the ENR annually as well, based on the construction cost impacts. There's a bunch of ways to look at that, I think, too. My biggest concern is just the 40-year time period.
Well, the thing is, even though you may not be able to track it, the note is going to be the one that controls the due date. And whoever forgets about, no one's ever going to forget about it, because when it transfers title and that note is due, the city's going to get the money.
So, Bob, just out of my curiosity, does that presume then that there'd be no payments made for that period?
Oh, no, it's their
So-
annual payments.
A year.
They're-
Yeah, so it's not really deferment, it's financing. I
Yeah,
think, yeah, we can use that language. George, you're muted.
We're deferring the first payment in this case for 2 years from occupancy,
right.
which is to, based on Bob's testimony, allows it to be fully rented and have an income stream to support that,
Yep.
rather than having to cough up that money when you pull a permit currently.
Yep.
So there's a motion and a second.
There's
more discussion?
there's one other thing on here, and that's the debt amount. It should be unlimited. I think right now the code has a cap of $200,000, which is ridiculously low. So whatever the fees are, they should, I think we had it on one of the other things, it just should be no cap on, you want to call it the loan amount?
Yeah, and I think Medford and Bend, both those jurisdictions, they have no cap.
So
Um,
I'd like to add the no cap on there also.
It seems to me that since we can't control the cost of construction and even the cost of the SDCs as they move forward, that not having a cap makes sense.
So would we call that a friendly amendment, Bob? And then George, do you accept the friendly amendment?
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And I also, as long as we're doing this, Bob, do you have a reaction to the 40-year, to Scott's 40-year concern? Or do you want to?
I think 30 years, I'd split it down the middle. And I'm just trying, here's my numbers. There'd be 25 to 30, and 25 and 30 are basically long-term. Okay, so it'll be usually residential income property is going to go for 25 to 30 years. So that's kind of what I'm trying to tie to.
So Brandon or Bill, is the low-income housing, is that a 25-year or 30-year?
It's a 30-year for ownership. It's a 60-year for multifamily. But again, the idea being is if it completes the full 60 years, it doesn't have to pay the SDCs. So it is essentially tied to the point of time and when a building would need to be rehabbed significantly. And the single family 30-year was correlated to 30-year loans are typical for single family homes. And tying a deed restriction to the property, again, that does require the city to do some legal work in terms of documentation and get that recorded. We wanted it to correspond with the typical financing for a single family home at 30 years.
I think that's what I was just trying to do, is tie it to the mortgage term on residential income property for rent.
Well, that would be 30 years, wouldn't it?
It's going to be 25 or 30.
Well, so if we've already got a program that's based on 30, I would recommend we just stick with that number. And again, this is all going to require code revision, and it's going to go through God knows how many hands after us. So we're making a recommendation to council, and this stuff will come out in the wash. I'm sure we can all come and testify as to how we got to where we got. But what to me is important about this motion is that we are trying to come up with an incentive to encourage multifamily rental construction in a way that the city's not done. So I would call the question if nobody's got any other comments or amendments.
Let's vote.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay,
Okay.
awesome. I'm so glad we have video of these things to clarify everything in the minutes.
Good job. Good discussion. Do
All right,
you
I'm gonna-
switch back? Okay,
Yep.
let's see. Okay. So last item, last slide and last item is stormwater credits. So this is specific to stormwater. And the question that was raised at our last meeting was potentially about having some credit for actions that people take on site to control their stormwater. And so the information that was provided in the packet relates to additional credits. So there are required credits under Oregon SDC law that if for qualified public improvements, which are defined basically as things that developers do on the site that's above and beyond what is needed for the development. So to meet current standards, or so if something is done beyond current standards with greater capacity to serve beyond what's required for the development, then there is a mechanism for credit under the statute for that qualified public improvement. And that applies up to what is due on the improvement fee portion of the SDC, and it's specific to the system. So it would have to be something done specifically for stormwater to get the stormwater credit. It would have to be something done for water to get the water credit, etc. So there are some examples of additional credits for stormwater specifically, where a development is directly discharging into a waterway. For Portland, it's got to be a big waterway like the Willamette River. Local streams and things which are considered, to be part of the stormwater management system are not eligible for credit. And but Portland does give credit for direct discharge and for control of a 100-year storm, which is significantly above what the standard that development is required to meet regularly. So that's like a 25-year storm. So even in those cases, one cannot be completely have the SDCs completely waived or exempted. It's for a portion of the SDC, and you had some information in your packet that spoke to some of the reasons why that is the case, that the city has to manage stormwater system wide, and even as development occurs and there are rights of way and other parts of the system upstream that require management of stormwater to protect the property and to enable travel on streets and things like that. And so you can get an SDC credit, but it's only a reduced amount. So in Portland's case, it's 45% of the SDC would be the maximum credit allowable for doing taking one of these actions above and beyond what's required of the development. For Medford, there's a 30% credit also for direct discharge. And then there are some other communities like Cornelius, smaller town, but it relates to a lot of the communities that are served by clean water services that are where there's two components of the SDC. There's a water quality component and a water quantity component. And so if you do something that is addresses water quality on your site, then you can get a credit for the water quality portion of the SDC. So these are some examples of how some other communities are providing some additional credit for stormwater SDCs. And, you know, this is as stormwater SDC programs or stormwater systems and management programs have matured over the last decade or two, and the SDCs have increased, as certainly in your case they have as well. We are starting to see more interest and more examples of stormwater SDC credits to recognize that there are certain circumstances relative to where the property discharges to, or actions that are taken that do have a potential impact to save the city money down the road in that through those on-site controls. But generally speaking, this is for when there are required development standards that everybody has to meet. That is not what triggers the credit. It's going above and beyond the required the requirements, because the project list and the capacity that has been identified as part of the master plan already assumes those standards are met, and there's still a need to increase capacity. So it's when people go above and beyond the standard when some additional credit is sometimes provided. I would say these are examples of cities who do provide credit. There's a lot of examples of cities that don't. What we brought specifically was some examples of credit programs. So it does require, you know, additional management of an administration of the credit program. So there is generally an impact to permit staff, but something that was requested for consideration and discussion by the committee at the last meeting. Scott, did I miss anything?
No, I think that kind of covers it. And, you know, especially we're talking about that capacity is still needed in the system. And being in an MS4 regulated community, there is still a significant amount of work that we need to do as part of the management of the storm drain system to meet those regulatory requirements. And they're only becoming more onerous. And so that's why you see the other communities that do give you a credit, you've gone well above and beyond what the existing standards are as part of a process, which I would support if the committee is interested in doing something as far as a credit, but you would have to go above and beyond what the design requirements already are as part of a process.
And generally, these credits are primarily for non-residential or I would say, well, non-single family residential would be for multifamily or commercial activities.
So just to understand, this is somebody that builds a bioswale as part of their landscape plan and consequently is providing 150% of their required stormwater control rather than the 100% that code is already requiring them to. And they get a credit for that extra 50%. Is that essentially kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, if that 50% is reduced from entering the system, period.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
correct. So you're sending 100% over the time-based flow requirement. So if you retain an additional 50% of the water that never leaves the site, then that's where you would get a credit for that improvement.
And there's some way you can calculate all of that.
Correct.
And there's a standard that you don't get the credit unless you provide at least X amount above the 100% you're already required to provide, right?
Correct. Usually they're using a design storm criteria.
So Rogue Valley uses a 10-year What is it?
They use a 10-year
Oh.
design storm with a 25-year overflow.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be real supportive of something like that if we could retain it, release it, any of those methods. I think they have 3 different levels in there, or 4 or something.
I think there's also important because Scott and I were looking at trying to understand more Rogue Valleys. And Scott, I thought you determined that they don't give an SDC credit, they give a rate credit for once the development is in and the rates are being charged, that the ongoing user fee was given credit.
Yeah, so we do have the circumstance. So RVSS gives no credit at all for storm drain as far as their program. And we do have a rate implication for specifically single family or multifamily or commercial property that drain directly to a water body. So if your property is adjoining a water body and you drain that whole property to the water body itself and don't connect to the storm drain system, you're not assessed a storm drain utility fee. So we do account for some of that in the utility fee itself.
So I was talking about using the mythology, but applying it towards the credit of the fee, not the monthly rate.
Yeah, and I think, we do both. We do have the ability to do both based on the code, but if we want to make it less nebulous than beyond what is needed, I would pick a design storm as your criteria for establishing whatever the credit would be. So if you meet the 50-year design storm and retain that excess amount completely on site, you would get a 30% credit on your SDC, or something similar to what Medford has in place. But pick a design storm. The 50-year and 100-year would be your next logical steps.
Every bit helps, right?
And you would, as far as the development, you would have to weigh that increased construction costs versus the SDC costs. So that would fall to the developer to determine.
Right.
Well, so I'm looking at the stormwater SDC for a 3,000 square foot impervious surface. It's, even at the new rate, is $2,200. I'm assuming a commercial stormwater, which I can't find in our notes, is more. But is this a significant incentive? I mean, even if we credit 45% of that, are we talking a couple $1,000s, or what are we talking here? Is anybody going to do it? Is basically my question.
You're right. I mean, that's the trade-off. They're going to have to, as Scott said, evaluate the value of the credit relative to the cost to take the additional action. And so the table that we looked at that has the 3,000, well, I could just go back maybe. It has a cost per square foot, and so this is how commercial and multifamily are assessed. It's going to be 74 cents roughly per square foot of impervious area.
Well, I think if we get into incentivizing at least retaining the water, given the fact that we need water, it's going to be, a mutual benefit. There is going to be a cost incurred to the person that builds the retention. There'll also be a less of a maintenance cost to water treatment.
I'm just thinking of the cost of land in Ashland and all the other stuff that we require, off-street parking and landscape and this and that and the other thing. And I'm just wondering whether this is a whole lot of messing around for something that's going to work maybe on 2 or 3 projects a decade.
You don't know.
Yeah, I generally agree with you, George. I don't see it being a significant impact. As far as what it would cost to construct something that would permanently retain on site, an extra 25-year event versus just paying the SDC for your impervious area as part of a program. Because if you're talking about having to have more swale open space area that allows ground-based saturation, you're taking up developable property as part of that.
Yeah,
So there's it's really,
I'd much
in my
rather have
mind, it's
built one
tough.
more unit.
Yeah.
So I suppose that I am not convinced that stormwater credits are an appropriate place for us to put our energy.
Does anybody know why Medford instituted a program?
I do not have the background on how they developed or why they instituted theirs. As Deb said, it's basically few and far between is part of the research that she's done and I've done where they have any sort of credit associated with the storm drain system. And the only credit you get is if you go well above and beyond.
Yeah.
And, you know, our code currently has that kind of in general. It's just not, it's more open. So it would be a one-on-one discussion between Public Works and the developer about what the potential credit could be based on what they would do above and beyond.
I think in those areas in Medford and everything, they're retaining water because the systems can't carry the overflow. So the developer has to build and retain the water.
Well, and that's part of what the SDC is you're paying so the rest of that system can handle that design flow after the development goes in. They just have to do the improvements that build the capacity to carry that flow.
Yeah.
You know, I think this, I'm just wondering if this maybe doesn't have to do more with perceived fairness. I just can't believe it's a huge economic incentive for somebody to choose to do something, but you know, for whatever reason, if you do something, you know, maybe it's just a way to kind of get recognition for it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, you know, really, like I said, Gary, we can control that on the one-on-one between Public Works and the developer using the existing code language. It's just not as prescriptive. So it would be something that we would have to negotiate in that development, which I'm comfortable with because there's ways to do that. Like we already talked about storm events, you know, and retention capabilities. So there's a way to actually calculate the benefit.
So the options are no change, let to the code, allow for that to be dealt with on a individualized basis, or to put in some credit for doing some control over and above the required development standard to be estimated based on by engineering, you know, based on the design storm that was treated and setting some maximum amount, most likely.
Without getting too far down in the weeds, then, you know, based on the discussion, I would recommend just keeping it as is. And we can clarify with the city council when we get there, that that's the intent of the code.
That works for me.
Yeah. All right.
Do you need a motion on that?
I don't
or-
think so, because we're not,
Okay,
we're not making a change.
okay.
We're recommending a change.
You got us on
Okay.
tape, Deb.
That's right. All right, so looks like we're we're good. And so we're on to next steps, which is council meeting in work session and then public hearing. And based on Oregon requirements, we have to, the city will have to issue a 90-day notice of the public hearing to interested parties, which are generally developers and other folks. And that will at some point write up the new methodologies and have that available at least 60 days prior to the public hearing.
And will we get like a draft of your summation of what this committee has recommended before it goes to council, please?
Yeah,
Is
so
that possible?
I'm drafting the staff report for the April 19th business meeting or study session. So I can send you guys that staff report that outlines everything in the process. I'll try to cover everything as comprehensively as I can. So if you guys want to comment and edit, I'd be more than willing to accept critique on that to make sure I cover all my bases when we go to council.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Good work. And that's hard when it's been a big pause, like 6 months. So you all did a great job of coming back up to speed, wrapping your heads around this. Appreciate it.
All right. Does anybody have anything else for the good of the order? Well, I just echo thanks to everyone for participating and going on this journey with Deb and I through this process. I think we have some good recommendations to bring forward to council. And like I said, I'll give you guys a heads up and send you my information before we take it to council. And then just part of the process, we'll keep you apprised of when the next meeting will be, when the methodology gets adopted as part of that process as well. So I thank everyone. And again, you guys know where to find me if you have any questions at all as well. So thank you again, and we will be in touch.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.